You smell it first. Beeswax, incense, something older, bone left too long in cloth. The room is hot. The shutters are closed against the afternoon sun. Candles burn at four corners of a heavy oak bed. The air does not move. You hear them now. Latin, soft, whispered by men in dark Franciscan robes. A surgical tray being arranged on a side table. Metal on metal, careful, slow. At the head of the bed, a man in a Flemish travel cloak is washing his hands in a basin of vinegar. Andreas Vesalius, the greatest anatomist alive. The man who rewrote what Europe knew about the human body. On the bed, beneath the linen, is a 17-year-old boy whose skull is about to be drilled open. It is early May, 1562. The Royal University of Alcalá de Henares, 20 miles east of Madrid. The boy on the bed is Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, the only legitimate heir to King Philip II of Spain. Sole inheritor of the largest empire the world has ever seen. This is not the trepanation of a peasant. This is not a routine procedure. This is medicine and miracle deployed at the same time, in the same room, on the same patient, by a father who refuses to let his only son die. In 4 weeks the boy will wake up. In 6 years his father will lock him in a windowless bedroom and never speak of him again. In 26 years the Catholic Church will canonize the saint of his recovery, the only canonization of an entire papacy. We can call this what it is, the canonized wound. If you have heard of Don Carlos before today, you almost certainly heard of him through a German play and an Italian opera. In 1787, Friedrich Schiller published Don Carlos. In 1867, Giuseppe Verdi turned it into the opera Don Carlos, one of the most performed grand operas in the world. That version goes like this. The prince loves his stepmother. The father has the son killed. Almost none of it is true. The narrative came from a Dutch propaganda pamphlet from 1581, written by William of Orange to legitimize his rebellion against Spain. 3 centuries of theatre had to leave out what really happened to tell the story they wanted. Most retellings of this prince focus on the romantic legend. Here is what they leave out. 3 documented events, 1 causal chain. First, the brain surgery you have just walked into, the most consequential medical procedure of the 16th century, performed under the supervision of Andreas Vesalius. Documented in royal correspondence preserved at Simancas. Second, a Catholic miracle the papacy formally recognised 26 years later. The relic at the centre of it still exists today. You can visit it on a weekday afternoon. Modern neurology has a separate name for the same event. We will use both. Third, a midnight in January 1568, in which a king walked into his only son's bedroom wearing armour under his velvet. And what he did there was not what the operas tell you. The contemporary chronicler who recorded that night wrote it down in the same flat administrative prose he used for routine palace business. We are building a community of 10,000 truth seekers. Subscribe. It tells YouTube to send you more stories like this one. Rewind to 1556. Spain stands at a height no kingdom has reached before. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, has just abdicated and split his empire in 2. The Austrian crown goes to his brother. The Spanish crown goes to his son. That son is Philip II. He is 29 years old. He inherits Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, Milan, the silver economy of the Americas, and territory reaching from Mexico to the Philippines. By 1580, he will add Portugal. He will preside over the largest empire in human history. He has 1 legitimate son. Don Carlos, born July 1545, to Philip's double first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal, who died 4 days after the birth. By 1562, Don Carlos is 17. He prefers horses to Latin. He is small and willful. But, and this matters, he is functional. The Venetian ambassador Paolo Tiepolo, who knew him personally and reported back to the Doge in confidential dispatches, describes the prince in early 1562 as fragile but capable of public ceremony, recognised across Europe as the legitimate heir. Tiepolo writes with the diplomatic care of a man who knows the Doge's cipher clerks read every line. He has nothing to gain from flattery. When he tells the Senate the boy is functional, the Senate has no reason to doubt it. Then comes April 19th, 1562. Not a battle, not an assassination, a flight of stairs. The accident itself we know in broad outline and not in detail. The 17-year-old prince was at the University of Alcalá. He went down a stone staircase faster than he should have. He struck his head. He did not get up. What happens next is what matters. Because what happens next is a doctrine. This wasn't superstition. This wasn't desperation. This was doctrine. A coherent royal doctrine with articulated logic. The king's body is the kingdom's body. The heir's body is the kingdom's future. If the heir is dying, the king must summon every instrument, medical, spiritual, political, to save him. To fail is to fail the kingdom God placed under his protection. The same logic that the leader's body is the institution's future is still how succession is managed in dynasties and authoritarian states today. Think about what this means. When Don Carlos was carried unconscious from the staircase, Philip did not choose between sending for the best doctor in Europe and praying for divine intervention. He sent for both. The same week, the doctor was Andreas Vesalius, inherited from Philip's father, Charles V, the personal physician of the imperial household, the man whose 1543 De Humani Corporis Fabrica had rewritten the science of human dissection. The relic was the body of Fray Diego de Alcalá, a Franciscan lay brother who had died in 1463, locally venerated but not yet canonized by Rome. His body was preserved at the nearby monastery of Santa Maria de Jesus, described in the monastery records as incorrupt. Philip ordered it brought to the prince's bedside. That is the scene you walked into at the start. Doctors and Franciscan friars working the same patient at the same time. For the modern viewer, this looks contradictory. For Philip's worldview, it was a single coordinated operation. The instruments are different. The salvation is one. When Don Carlos wakes from his coma in late May 1562, he is weak. Disoriented, he will carry a scar he cannot hide for the rest of his short life. But within weeks he is speaking again, then walking, then resuming what he understands as his duties. For a moment, stand inside him. You are 17 years old. You have been unconscious for 3 weeks. The smell of incense and bones still hangs in the room. Someone tells you 100-year-old monk's bones were laid against your body. Someone tells you the greatest anatomist in Europe drilled into your skull. Someone tells you that, by every law of medicine, you should be dead. You owe a debt. You don't write poems about it. You don't disappear into prayer. You order ornaments for the saint's tomb. You sign the alms documents. You distribute money to the Franciscan monastery, more according to the surviving royal treasury accounts than to any other religious cause of your entire short life. You file the debt, line by line, into the royal accounts that will outlive you. A boy with a brain bleed sat with treasury clerks and itemised his debt to a dead monk. He was already losing his mind. He was still trying to be a good Catholic. Think about what this means. Don Carlos was not just a patient. He was a participant. He understood the debt and he tried to pay it. He did not succeed. We will see why in a moment. Inside the breaking man was a frightened 17-year-old trying to be holy. The system around him would not see that. The system would only see the failure. For about a year, Don Carlos seems to be recovering. Slowly, imperfectly, but functional. He attends court, he writes letters, he performs his ceremonial duties. Then something begins to change. By 1564, 2 years after the surgery, the change is no longer subtle. By 1567, it is undeniable. The Venetian ambassador reports back to the Senate. The French ambassador Fourquevaux reports back to the French court. The Duke of Alba reports to Philip himself. Cardinal Diego de Espinosa, the king's first minister, reports through his confessional channels. The picture they paint is consistent. The prince attempts to throw a young page from an upper-story palace window. The prince repeatedly mistreats horses brought to him from the royal stables. The prince draws a weapon on Cardinal Espinosa at table. The prince consumes compulsive quantities of ice water and sleeps on cold stone slabs to dampen what he calls the burning in his head. The prince speaks openly, in confession and in court, of his desire to murder a man whose name he refuses to give. His confessor, Fray Diego de Chaves, eventually identifies the man Don Carlos wants to kill. It is Philip II, his father. Read that again. The legitimate heir of the largest empire in the world is planning to murder its king, and he is telling his confessor. The modern medical reconstruction by Dr. Pedro Gargantilla, head of internal medicine at El Escorial Hospital, in his 2005 study Enfermedades de los Reyes de España, diagnoses what no one in 1567 could name: severe post-traumatic injury to the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, disinhibition, impulsive aggression, paranoia, compulsive behavior, social judgment, collapse. The pattern Gargantilla reconstructs retroactively is the same diagnostic checklist neurologists in major trauma centres use today for frontal lobe injury. Same syndrome, different millennium. This was not a curse, this was not madness, this was a wound. The canonized wound, the wound the Catholic Church would one day formally bless, was already, year by year, finishing the work the stairs began. You thought this was about a head injury. It wasn't. It was about what happens when a doctrine of total royal control meets a body that will no longer obey it. January 18th, 1568, 11 o'clock at night, the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. Cold, dark. Don Carlos is in his bedchamber on the upper floor. He's been wakeful for weeks. He has stockpiled coin drawn through trusted agents. He has requested fast horses from the royal stables. He is preparing to flee Spain. Here the sources diverge. Geoffrey Parker, after 4 decades in the Spanish archives, argues Don Carlos was preparing to flee to the Spanish Netherlands, to join the Protestant rebels his father was crushing. Henry Kamen, equally long in the same archives, is more sceptical. He reads the escape papers as the disordered planning of a mind already failing. We will not settle that here. What is not ambiguous is the Christmas Eve confession 3 weeks earlier. The prince told Fray Diego de Chaves he intended to kill a man. The confessor refused absolution. He consulted other theologians. They consulted the king. Philip is now outside his son's door. He is 40 years old. He is the most powerful man in Christendom. He has signed the death warrants of rebels and heretics by the hundreds. Tonight he's going to do something a Spanish king has never done before. He's wearing armour under his clothes. With him are 4 of his most trusted nobles: Rua Gomez de Silva, Prince of Eboli, the Duke of Feria, the Prior of Castile, his almoner Luis Manrique, plus 4 guards. They enter. Don Carlos sits up in bed. He sees his father. He sees armed men. He sees the armour. He asks one question, transcribed by the contemporary court chronicler. "Are they coming to kill me?" Philip answers. "Be calm. What is being done is for your own good." Cabrera de Córdoba, who later became Philip's official court chronicler, records the entire midnight arrest in the same flat administrative prose he uses elsewhere for routine palace business. He treats it as procedure. The king arrived, the papers were taken, the windows were sealed. That is how Spain remembered the imprisonment of its only legitimate heir for 3 centuries. The guards seize the prince's weapons, his papers, his coin. The windows of the bedchamber are nailed shut from the outside. A permanent watch is set at the door. Philip turns and walks out. He will never see his son again. For 6 months, Don Carlos remains in that room. The official cause of death when it comes is multi-organ failure following self-destructive behaviour, alternating between hunger strikes and gorging, refusing all medical care. Between the Trepanation in May 1562 and this room, 6 years and 2 months have passed. In those 6 years, the prince's body visibly recovered, while by every contemporary report, the executive function inside it continued to fail. The wound healed on the outside. The judgment did not. He dies on July 24, 1568. He is 23. He has been imprisoned exactly 188 days, 6 months and a week, long enough for the windows nailed shut in January to remain nailed shut through the longest days of the Madrid summer. His body is buried at the convent of Santo Domingo el Real in Madrid. There is no public funeral, no state proclamation of the cause, just silence. The anatomist who supervised the surgery died 2 years after Don Carlos's recovery. Vesalius, shipwrecked on the Greek island of Zakynthos in October 1564 on his way back from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Buried in an unmarked grave, he was 49. The Cardinal Don Carlos drew a weapon on died unexpectedly 4 years later in September 1572. Cause uncertain. The confessor who heard the Christmas Eve confession served the royal family for decades and kept the secret all his life. The papers of what Don Carlos actually said that night remain locked in the royal archives. 458 years. They have not been fully opened, Philip went on. He ruled for 30 more years. He commissioned the Spanish Armada. He saw it sink. He built El Escorial. He died inside it. He never spoke publicly about his son. He never explained the arrest. He never published any account. The silence was the doctrine, and by every reasonable expectation, that should have been the end of the story. The king kept his silence. The prince was buried without ceremony. The truth would die in the archives, but there was still Fray Diego de Alcalá, the Franciscan whose 100-year-old bones had been laid against Don Carlos's body in May 1562. This is where the story turns. For 20 years after Don Carlos's death, Philip pressed the papacy in Rome to canonize Fray Diego. He sent dossiers. He sent ambassadors. He invoked the miracle of the prince's recovery as the central attested miracle of the cause. On July 2nd, 1588, 3 months before the Spanish Armada sailed from Lisbon to its destruction, Pope Sixtus V signed the bull of canonization. Fray Diego de Alcalá became St. Diego. This was the first formal canonization performed by the Catholic Church in 65 years. 3 generations. No saint had been elevated to the altars of Catholic Europe in the lifetime of any grandfather alive in 1588. It was also the only canonization of the entire papacy of Sixtus V. The single saint elevated by one of the most active popes of the late 16th century. The miracle Rome formally confirmed, the central attested miracle in the official dossier, was the recovery of a prince who 20 years before had been buried in unmarked silence by the same king who now stood watching the new saint elevated to the altars. Read that again. The relics of St. Diego rest today in the magistral cathedral of Alcalá de Henares, 20 miles east of Madrid, the same university town where the boy fell in 1562. Bronze and crystal. You can visit them on any weekday afternoon. They are the most visible artifact in this entire story. They are also the official answer to the question Philip never let anyone ask. Modern neurology has a name for what happened to Don Carlos. We did not have it in 1562. We did not have it in 1588, We did not get it until 1848. That year, in Cavendish, Vermont, a 25-year-old railroad foreman named Phineas Gage was struck in the head by an iron rod during a tamping accident. The rod passed through the front of his brain, taking part of his frontal lobe with it. He survived. He walked away. He spoke. He was no longer the same man. His friends and family recorded that the foreman they had known was gone. In his place was a stranger, impulsive, profane, unable to plan. Phineas Gage became the founding case study of modern neurology, the case that taught medicine that personality lives in the frontal lobe, and that destroying it does not always kill the man. It destroys the man and leaves the body to walk. The frontal lobe is what neurology today calls the seat of executive function, the part that decides whether what you're about to do is wise. When it is destroyed, the body keeps walking, the face keeps speaking, the signature keeps being signed. The judgment is gone. What survives is a man who looks like himself and behaves like a stranger. What Phineas Gage taught 19th century medicine, Don Carlos lived 286 years earlier. Same lobe, same destruction. The difference is that Phineas Gage was a railroad worker. He could be sent home. He could be cared for by family. The world did not depend on his judgment. Don Carlos was the heir to the largest empire on earth. Don Carlos was buried in silence. Philip kept the cause of death sealed. The bones of Fray Diego, the bones laid against the wounded prince in May 1562, were canonized in 1588. They rest today in Alcalá. You can visit them. The miracle the church formally recognized was the same event that produced the empire's catastrophe. You smell it again. Beeswax, incense, something older. The same room. The same shutters closed against the same afternoon. Metal on the same surgical tray. But this time, you know what it means. The boy on the bed will live. The empire on the bed will die. Philip II called for the greatest mind in medicine. He got it. He called for the greatest miracle in his kingdom. He got it. He got the son he asked for. He got the prince he could not keep. The canonized wound was not the boy's. It was the empire's. Don Carlos survived the fall. The prince who got up was not the prince who fell.